Alright guys, welcome back. We may be done with the fighting in World War I, but we're not done with World War I altogether. We need to look now at the legacies of the First World War. Legacies meaning, long-term impacts and effects of the war. And, well, let's talk about those. So we're going to first look at the death toll of World War I. And up until that point in history, it was the bloodiest war ever. And in fact, let's do a little kind of guesstimate here. So how many people do you think died in World War I? Okay, think of a number in your mind. Think of all these battles we talked about and the civilians who were hungry and sick and all that stuff. What number would you come up with? And it turns out about 9 million soldiers are going to die in World War I. 9 million. And on the civilian side, it's hard to give you an accurate number. Estimates go from as low as 6 million to as high as 13 million. So, a good round number for World War I is about 20 million dead. 20 million. Again, there had never been a war like this, at least in modern history. And it's not just, of course, the soldiers who don't come home. It's also the soldiers who come home wounded from this war. A war like World War I with the modern weapon technology is, it's brutal, and it just really rips the human body apart. And so soldiers come home missing limbs or eyes or their hearing. And these are most of the time pretty young men, or 19, 20 years old. And now they have to adjust to life with only one leg or only one arm or no arms or, whatever the situation is. And then some soldiers came home and they were disfigured in such a way as to make them, make it really difficult to transition back into their civilian life. You can see this person here, he's lost his nose. And so what they would do is they would make these, it's basically a mask, that's a prosthetic that the soldier would wear to kind of cover up some of the worst parts of the wounds so that they can at least try to re-enter normal life. And then, of course, you have soldiers who come home who have no visible wounds, but they're still wounded, only they're wounded mentally. We, of course, today would call this post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD for short. They called it shell shock in World War I. They thought that basically your brain kind of got, just scrambled basically from the concussion of artillery shells. They didn't really understand the full psychology behind this suffering. Now, to make matters worse, as World War I begins to wind down, the world witnesses one of the greatest pandemics in history. It's the so-called Spanish flu. And this is going to kill at least 20 million people around the world. Some estimates are much higher than that. Some estimates go as high as 50 million. Here in America, almost 750,000 Americans are going to die from the Spanish flu. And again, back-to-back, massive losses of life. World War I and then Spanish flu combined, we're talking, again, probably 40 to 50 million dead at least around the world. Here's an example of what we're looking at here. This is in America. I believe it's in Seattle, if my memory serves me well. And the hospitals are completely overwhelmed, so they're just housing these patients in what looks like a warehouse just to have some place to keep them. Here's an advertisement for something that's supposedly going to protect you against the flu, a germ-killing throat tablet. I doubt that these things are very effective, of course. And here is a guy who apparently really likes smoking because he's willing to wear a mask but also smoke at the same time. He doesn't want that influenza, but apparently he wants to smoke. So, yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense. All right, let's think about emotions and reactions to World War I. And no surprise here that there was a lot of sadness, a lot of confusion, a lot of disillusionment from World War I. Before World War I, there was kind of a general optimism in the world that things were getting better, new technologies are coming online, electricity, cars, airplanes. The world seemed to be almost like with unlimited potential. And then along comes this conflict where a whole generation is wiped out, and people just didn't understand it. They were left bitter. They were left feeling empty and confused and like wondering what life is even all about. And you see this in a lot of the literature that comes out of World War I and also in the 1920s. People like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway are famous authors from this era. Hemingway himself was in World War I, not as a soldier, but as an ambulance driver, so he got to see firsthand just the brutal waste of war. All right, now let's go back to the war itself here. So we know an armistice ended the fighting on November 11th, 1918, but an armistice is just a ceasefire. To officially end the war, you need a peace treaty. So let's talk about how the peace treaty comes about and what the effects of the peace treaty are. So once the war winds down, it's time to negotiate that final treaty. And they're going to have this in Paris, France. It's called the Paris Peace Conference. So all the big allies are there to talk this out. The Central Powers are not invited to this conference, so they don't get a say in the final treaty. Russia also was not invited, and the reason for that is, as we're going to find out in our final video in this unit, Russia dropped out of the war towards the end of the war, and the Allies felt betrayed by that. Now, while there were lots of Allied nations, really the big decisions were made by the so-called Big Four. This was David Lloyd George of Britain, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Woodrow Wilson of the United States. Now, they all have the same idea, let's draw up a treaty to end the war, but they all have very different visions of what that treaty looks like. So they have competing goals. For example, Wilson wanted what he called peace without victory. In other words, let's have a war where no side feels like they've been overly punished or overly victorious. Georges Clemenceau is not happy about that. He wants France to get something out of Germany. Right? Germany had invaded France. 1 million French people are dead. He wants revenge on the Germans, of course. Orlando wants land from Austria. David Lloyd George wants money to help rebuild his country. So they all have different visions of what this peace would look like. Now, one thing that they do agree on, though, is something that's similar to our current day United Nations. And what it was called the League of Nations. This is kind of like the ancestor of the current United Nations. And what this was is something that Wilson had called collective security. And what he meant by that is the countries of the world would come together and form this organization. And this organization called the League of Nations would help to negotiate and avoid war. So think back to what started World War I. You had the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. If the League of Nations had existed, in theory, what could happen is we could have gotten Austria and Serbia to sit down and talk this out rather than going to war. And then that war would not have spread to the rest of the world. So again, it's a way of attempting to prevent future wars by really kind of proactively avoiding them. All right, so here is a map showing you kind of all the different members of the League of Nations. For example, a founding member who joined and was there all the way till the end, and a founding member that left and then rejoined, and so forth. There's a lot of different categories here. If you look at America, you'll notice we're that pink color that says non-members. And this is one of the great ironies of World War I, that the League of Nations was really Woodrow Wilson's brainchild. Like, this was the thing he was pushing for above all else. And so you can argue that the League of Nations is really an American idea, an American product. And yet America never actually joined the League of Nations. And because America was the most powerful nation in the world at the time, our absence from this organization means that the League of Nations never really lives up to its potential. And it's going to be, frankly, ineffective at preventing future wars, like, say, World War II. And that's what we're looking at here with this cartoon, that the League of Nations is just simply too weak and too ineffective to prevent war. All right, well, let's now look at revisit the Middle East, and we learned that during World War I, the British had helped spark Arab rebellions across the southern part of the Ottoman Empire, and those Arab rebels had assumed that they were going to get independence because of those revolts. And that is not what's going to happen. At the Paris Peace Conference, Britain and France decided to carve the Middle East into these things called mandates, which were kind of sort of colonies. I mean, they're not officially a colony, but it's basically a colony. And the theory behind these mandates was that these people in these areas weren't ready for independence, and so therefore Britain and France would kind of govern over them until they decided the people in these different areas were ready for independence. So we're going to delay your independence until we think that you're ready for this. This was pretty insulting to the Arab rebels who had fought for independence during this war, and they felt betrayed by this. There is T.E. Lawrence of Arabia there at the Paris Peace Conference. And so we went from having the Ottoman Empire controlling the Middle East to having a bunch of mandates the British and French were sharing. All right, let's talk about the end result of this Paris Peace Conference. It's called the Treaty of Versailles, and that is a throwback all the way to our very first unit. You might remember Versailles, this glittering palace outside of Paris, France, where the King Louis lived and had a great time until, of course, the French Revolution. But it's called the Treaty of Versailles because that is where the treaty will be signed. And specifically, it's going to be signed in the Hall of Mirrors, the most famous room of the palace. And this is the same room, by the way, that the first German emperor was crowned in. There's Bismarck. He had led that effort. And there is the Hall of Mirrors today. So if you ever go to Paris and you go to Versailles on a tour or something, you'll no doubt go through the Hall of Mirrors. All right, so which country is going to get the most blame for World War I? That's the big question. And remember, we talked about this in our very first video. All the countries feel as though they are the victim, that they had done nothing wrong. But of course, the winners get to write the history books, and Germany lost this war, and so they are going to get the blame in the Treaty of Versailles. So Germany was not invited to the Paris Peace Conference, so they had no say in the treaty itself. They were expected just to kind of sign on the dotted line. And by the way, this entire time that this treaty is being hammered out and negotiated, the British blockade remained in place. So the Germans are still basically starving under a blockade, and they have basically no choice but to sign this treaty, no matter how bad it is. And it was bad for Germany. Germany was expected to pay for the war. Okay, they were going to have to pay reparation payments at something like $30 billion. And that is in World War I dollars. This is close to $3 trillion in modern dollars. This, would have just ripped the heart out of the German economy. This, in theory, would have destroyed the German economy for years, decades to come. In addition to that, Germany lost land. Okay, they're going to lose Alsace and Lorraine to France. All of their colonial empires taken from them. Their military is restricted to a tiny amount. Their battleships are taken and destroyed. Their submarines are destroyed. This was, absolutely humiliating for Germany. And they also had to accept sole blame for the war. They literally had to sign the line that says, Germany started World War I and is responsible for all the damage of World War I, which, is not truly fair. Okay, Germany didn't, they certainly helped to start World War I. There's no doubt about that, and they do deserve some blame for that. But other countries do as well. To give all the blame to Germany and none to any of the other countries seemed just particularly unfair to the Germans. And so the Germans are left after this war humiliated, weakened, and incredibly bitter, and they want revenge. And, this is something that a future leader of Germany could play on and really play up those fears. And of course, I'm thinking about, Hitler, right? He's going to play on those fears. Again, Germany's going to lose land here and there and there and every old where. And so the Treaty of Versailles You know, this is going to play a big role in the rise of Hitler and the launching of World War II, right? Try again, Germany will. All right, so guys, that is it for our legacies of World War I. And while we're done with World War I as kind of a big topic, we are still going to look at one more thing in this unit because World War I is going to play a major role in causing a revolution in Russia, which is going to be our final topic in our final video.